Hello and welcome to a special video on my podcast all about knitting and crochet and my yarn shop here in Wiesbaden, Germany. I'm Kiko and today is November 23rd, but you will be able to see the video from next Monday on so that I have my usual Monday evening video. Today I wanted to talk about needle sizes and gauge and what difference it makes if you use a different needle with the same yarn. And most of us know that every yarn has a recommended needle size, and some people think they have to use this needle size. And also patterns call for a certain needle size in yarn, and they also call for a certain gauge. And some people think you have to have this gauge. And yes, if you have that gauge that's recommended in the pattern, then your knitted piece should be the same size as given in the pattern. But gauge and size is only one aspect. The other aspect is that if we knit to a different gauge, the fabric we create will be different. So sometimes, for example, if a pattern calls for a really tight gauge, maybe I want it to be a bit looser and softer, so I can choose to knit a different gauge, but then I will have to make calculations so that the size will still be the one that I want. So basically, there is no right or wrong needle per se. So if you use, everything I'm going to show you today is knit with a 4-ply sock yarn. But I'm going to show you many different needle sizes that I used, and that created different fabrics. And I want to show you what kind of fabric I wanted and why I chose the needles I used. So I'm going to start with projects where I only used one yarn at a time, so I'm not using two colors at the same time. This is very colorful, but it's all one yarn for every project. And these are 6 different projects, and I used 6 different needle sizes, even though everything was knit with 4-ply sock yarn. So I start with this little gnome, patterned by Sarah Shearer. This is the Here We Gnome Again gnome, and I used a 2.0 millimeter needle. So I think this is the smallest needle I'm going to talk about today. With 4-ply sock yarn, they usually recommend either a 2.5 millimeter needle, because that's the average needle that most people use for socks, or they recommend 2 to 3 millimeter, because some yarns give you a range of needle sizes, because people knit differently. So you have yarn, you have needles, but you also have the knitter. And I have a friend, if we want to knit the same yarn to the same gauge, her needle has to be at least a millimeter thinner than mine, because I'm a tight knitter and she's a loose knitter. So it's those 3 components really that go into the mix of what you create. So if I knit the 4-ply sock yarn with a 2 millimeter needle, I get a really dense fabric, which I want in a project that I'm going to fill with stuffing. I don't want the stitches to be so wide that the stuffing shows. With this, it really doesn't. And the cables come out really, they show really nicely because of the dense fabric. And most of my gnomes are knit on a 2.5 millimeter needle, so they are looser and softer than this one, but still tight enough to not show the stuffing. I just wanted to show you this was the tightest gauge that I could find in a single color that I've knit. So this is a 2.0 millimeter needle. The next project I'm showing you is this little star cushion that I knit. By the way, I knit it while I filmed a tutorial on how to knit this star cushion. You can find this in the playlist for tutorials. And for this star cushion, I used a 2.5 millimeter needle. As I said, that's the needle I usually use for the gnomes when knitting this yarn. And you can see that the stitches are fairly small and fairly tight, so the stuffing really doesn't show through. And but still, it's a little bit softer than the gnome, which will mainly be sitting somewhere and be looked at, whereas a cushion is something that I might touch, that I might want to put my head on or just cuddle a little bit. So this is a 2.5 millimeter needle. It's still fairly tight. This is the needle that most people use for knitting socks. I sometimes do that. Those socks will be fairly tight, which is good, so they will last a long time. They usually, I don't knit socks to be really soft unless I knit soft socks to be worn in bed. But if I want socks that I walk around on, that I use a lot, a tight fabric is good. The next project I'm going to show you is a sock actually, but it's a baby or children's sock. So I don't think the child would run around a lot because I'm not quite sure whether it'd be already able to walk. But even if it was able to walk, even if that fitted a 1-year-old child, they're not as heavy. They don't put as much pressure on the sock as a grown-up person would. So this doesn't have to be too tight. Most baby socks I would even knit on a 3 millimeter needle, but here I use the 2.75 millimeter needle, which is my favorite needle to use for socks. I think I filmed a tutorial for this sock as well because I wanted to see how much sock you could knit with 10 grams of yarn, because Opal has these 10-gram mini balls. So you need 10 grams of yarn to knit one sock in this size, which is a baby or toddler size. And again, it's still fairly tight. It's the kind of sock that I wear a lot, and so far most of my socks haven't worn through yet. I think the only socks that I've had holes in were either ones where I snagged on something and the yarn just ripped because I stepped on something, or the yarns that were not 75% wool and 25% polyamide. So I had one pair with silk in it that those I just got several holes in them. And there was one other pair, I can't remember what that was, but it wasn't the usual kind of sock yarn. So that's 2.75. Then the next project I'm going to show you is this pullover. This is 4 different colorways of Opal sock yarn, but I only ever knit one color at a time. And this is out of the German magazine Knit the Cat. It's a bit strange that the German magazine has an English name, but still, it's one of my favorite magazines. The projects in the magazine all use Schoppel Wolle, Schoppel yarn. They have their own sock yarn, so I tend to knit their projects with Opal yarn. And but they called for a 2.5 millimeter needle for this pullover, and I thought, I'm not going to do that. That'll be too tight. So 3 millimeter needle is what I use to knit socks with. And they are a bit softer than the 2.75 or 2.5 millimeter needle. But for a pullover, it's still fairly tight. So it makes for a nice and warm pullover, but it's not quite as soft, and it doesn't have quite the same drape as if I knit it with a bigger needle. But for me, that was a sort of compromise to not do the 2.5 millimeter needle. And I think that with the 3.0 millimeter needle, my gauge was almost correct with what they gave in the pattern, and I just adjusted for the small difference there was. And I'm not quite sure whether I measured it perfectly, because this is a top-down raglan pullover. So I did look at the pattern with how many stitches I started and how to do the increases and how to arrange the colors. But then I just tried it on and knit it with my own numbers. So how many increases I did and how long or short the pullover is. Yeah, so this is the 3.0 millimeter needle. Then the next project I have, the pattern is called Mamelucker, and these are short pants that I knit for myself. So these are not pants that I would sort of run around in public with, but I like to wear them underneath a skirt in winter because they really keep me nice and warm, and I can wear any kind of skirt on top and it won't show. And so I really, really like these. And I knit them with a 3.5 millimeter needle. So I wanted it to be fairly soft and flexible, not too tight, but still warm. And again, I don't remember whether I had the right gauge from the pattern, but this was just the kind of fabric that I liked, and then I worked the numbers around the fabric that I wanted. So yeah, that was a really fun knit. I might knit another one. I might knit one with long legs, so basically leggings, but with the basic pattern from the Mamelucker, because that's a really comfortable fit. So that's a 3.5 millimeter needle. And then the last project, for the single color project, I brought this baby jacket. It's a pattern by Telly Bean Knits out of her book Knit Happy with Self-Striping Yarn, and it's knit in many different directions so that the stripes in the yarn come out differently, and the stripes aren't too small. Yeah, and I knit this on a 4 millimeter needle. The 4 millimeter needle is my favorite needle to knit pullovers with. So especially for baby things, I really want things to be soft. I don't mind the knits to be loose. So if I put stuffing in here, if I wanted to sort of stuff the pullover, I think you can see that my fingers sort of show through a little bit. So that would not be the right gauge to yeah, make a stuffed animal or something. And I just realized that I do like to knit the yarn with a 4 millimeter needle for clothes, but for shawls, I like to use even bigger needles. And I did not look for I might have knit a shawl or a scarf with a bigger needle, but I think you can imagine that. So if we look at the stitches with this baby jacket with the 4 millimeter needle, and we look at the stitches, let's look at the bottom because those are stockinette stitches. I think there's a big difference. And even though it's the same yarn, there's a big difference because of the different needles that I used. So these are the single color projects. And then I brought another pile of projects where I knit stranded color work. So these are all 2 color or more projects that I all knit with 4-ply sock yarn. But again, I used 6 different needle sizes, but they're different needle sizes than the ones that I just showed you. And the thing is that with color work, a lot of people say that their color work is tighter than their one color knitting, so they tend to use bigger needles. But I think the tightness comes from not having the floats loose enough. And when I started knitting as a teenager, those Icelandic sweaters, or we called them Norwegian sweaters, with the patterned yoke were very popular, and we knit lots and lots of them. And I remember I was always so afraid of having the floats too tight that I tend to have them very loose. So that means that with me, stranded color work is always a bit looser than if I just knit with one color. So I tend to go down with my needle size. But that's what I meant by you have to look at the knitter as well, not just the yarn and the needle and the pattern, but the knitter and how we personally knit. And even though I'm a tight knitter, I tend to knit the color work loosely, so I go down with the needle size. Now this is a mitten from the book Knit Like a Latvian, and those mittens have a lot of stitches, so they use very small needles and I think a finer yarn than the sock yarn, and they use many stitches. So this mitten is knit on 70 stitches, which is a lot, and yeah, I'm pretty sure it's 70, could be 72, but I don't know. Anyway, so I decided I do want to use the sock yarn and not thinner yarn than that. I could have used the lace yarn. Anyway, I decided to go for the 2.0 millimeter needle just to make sure it's not too big. And it isn't. It really fits nicely. It's rather loose. It's not tight at all. The thumb's rather big, but I prefer mittens to be rather loose than tight. I think they keep warmer when there's a bit air in between, and if they are too tight, they're not I feel they don't keep you quite as warm. So I'm pretty to have it a bit bigger, but I use the 2.0 millimeter needle to get the right size. But that meant I get a really tight fabric, which again is a good thing for a mitten because it means that less wind comes through and less cold. And I used the lighter yarn is an opal sock yarn, so it's wool with polyamide. But the dark blue is the alpaca sock yarn by Hansa Farm, and that's 75% alpaca with 25% polyamide. But because of the alpaca content, even though it's knit really tightly, it's still soft. So I'm really, really happy with these mittens. So that was 2.0 millimeter. The next project is my Halloween hat. It's another pattern by Tally Bean Knits, I think. It's a single pattern that you can buy on Ravelry or maybe her homepage, I don't know. And for hats, I usually... I didn't even know what my favorite needle for a hat is. But the reason I use the 2.25 millimeter needle, I knew it's rather small for a hat, but the other needles were all busy. I had all my other needles in projects, so the 2.25 was the one I had. So I decided I'll try and use a rather small needle. It means the hat came out smaller than it was supposed to be. I think I knit the second biggest size, so this should have been an adult's medium size, but it's more like a big child's or small adult size. But because it's knit fairly tightly, it means the pattern shows really nicely. So, and again, it's warmer this way than if I had knit it more loosely. I'll show you other hats in a minute. So I'm still very happy. The fact that it doesn't fit me is because I didn't knit a gauge swatch. I just thought, well, the hat is going to fit somebody. If you don't mind about the size you get, you don't have to knit a gauge swatch. You only need to knit a gauge swatch if you want the piece to fit, to fit a particular person. So yeah, still happy with the hat. 2.25 millimeter needle. The next project is a sock. It's going to be a knee-high sock. It's this beauty. It's not finished yet, but I thought I can still show you. So I told you before that my favorite needle for socks is a 2.75. And as I go down for color work, I'm using a 2.5 millimeter needle for this color work sock. I am happy with the fabric I'm getting. It's still flexible enough to put my foot through. It's fairly tight, so I think they should last long enough. I think for these I did not switch for the toe and the heel because I thought it's okay to have the toe and the heel a bit tighter than usual. At the moment I'm knitting the film reel socks for my sister, and I'm going to knit more socks in that pattern for all her family. And with those socks, I'm actually changing the needle size, whether I'm doing color work or the single color bits in the pattern. So I'm switching between 2.5 and 2.75 for those socks. If you watch my regular podcast, you have seen them and will see them again. Yeah, so this is a 2.5 millimeter needle color work sock. Really happy with that. It's tight enough to be a good sock, but it's the floats are long enough so I can put it on and take it off. Really happy with that. The next project is another mitten, and that's one I knit quite some time ago when I got the first statement knitting. I think is what the book is called. I'll try and link all the books underneath the video if you're interested. And they had mittens in the book, but you can pick your own pattern. So I knit one mitten with elephants and one with a giraffe. And I used the wrong side. The 2.75 millimeter needle. So that means it's more like a 3 millimeter needle from the gauge I get. And that's something that I like for mittens. So they're not too tight. They're still kind of soft, but still warm. And especially with the two color knitting with all the strands you have, it's like having a double layer. So I really like that. And I like the fabric that I got, and I sewed on little beads. Did I sew them on or knit them in? No, I knitted them in. So I knitted little beads onto the stitch that marked the eyes. I really like that. I love elephants. So that's 2.75. And then I found a hat that I knit some time ago. That was part of the pattern battle from this Opal subscription that I get, where you get 6 balls of yarn and you have no idea which colors you're going to get. And then one of them is chosen for the pattern battle, and everybody who takes part knits the same yarn, but a different pattern than everybody else. And I came up with this design so nobody could have knit the same hat. And we are allowed to use a certain percent of a different color for the pattern battle, and the bit of contrast color that I have in here was okay to take part. And so this was knit with a 3mm needle, so it's a fairly soft, loose hat, which I think is good. I hate tight hats. And normally I would not knit a hat looser than that, because if it's looser than that, I'd be afraid of having of the hat being too loose and not sit tightly on your head. So yeah, a 3mm needle for color work, which is sort of like a 3.5 without color work, I think is a good size for me to knit a hat. I guess I stuck to the 3.0mm for the ribbing, so that is a bit tighter. I might have changed to a bigger needle for the decreases, but I'm not sure. Probably didn't, because it's okay to have that a bit tighter as well. So that's that hat. And then the last project is another hat, and that's the Go Big or Go Gnome hat by Sarah Shearer. So we start and end with gnomes. And the reason I knit that on a 3.5mm needle is that this hat was the gauge swatch for my Go Big or Go Gnome pullover that I just finished knitting. And I showed off on my the last 2 regular podcast episodes. So I'm pretty sure I knit the ribbing on a 3.5mm needle. I definitely knit the color work on a 3.5mm needle. With the pullover, I changed to a 4.0 needle for the single color parts like the front and back and the sleeves. With the hat, again, I may not have changed for the decreases because I wouldn't measure the gauge in this part, but I wanted to know my gauge in the color work part, because that was what told me which size to knit. So this hat is actually fairly loose, and but on the other hand, it's so light, it doesn't really slide into my face. And even though this is fairly loose, it doesn't slide down, it doesn't fall off my head, so it's okay, and I don't mind this being loose. And it means it's really soft, it's really nice to wear, and I'm really happy with it. And maybe I could just hold those two together. So very loosely knit gnome, very tightly knit gnome. Yeah, so that's basically everything I wanted to show you today, just to show you it is possible to use different needles with the same yarn, depending on how you knit and depending on what you want to make and what kind of fabric you want to achieve, whether you knit with one color or with several colors. All these things make a difference, and it's always worth knitting a gauge swatch. So you get to know your pattern, you find out what kind of fabric you're creating, and you can make sure that whatever you knit is going to fit. Yeah, I hope you enjoyed this short special video, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!